Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you who've actually managed to brave the weather to come out this evening. The Brits often think we have sort of, unusually challenging weather, but we have seen nothing yet. Your comment about Mark Carney, there's a book to be written about the central bankers who've been allowed to make policy in countries that aren't the countries of their birth. And in joking aside, I never tire of saying that it is a rare privilege to be asked to do that. I say that with some humbleness, because coming to any country that you didn't grow up in and learning the economy and trying to deliver policy for the Australian people is a privilege, but it's also something I don't take lightly. So thank you for that comparison, but I don't think I'll be following suit anytime soon. Of all the trends, if you could put the first slide up, I'm not quite sure who's doing that. Next one, please. Of all the trends shaping the Australian economy over the past half-century, one of the most profound has been the long swing towards Asia, and more specifically in recent years to China, shown up there in the red. Now our biggest single trading partner, of course, by a country mile. But China's also front and centre in the US administration's rapidly evolving tariff strategy. How that strategy plays out and how China responds are therefore key issues for the economic outlook here in Australia, and hence for the RBA's monetary policy. Given the importance of understanding the Chinese economy, the RBA has maintained a small team based at the Australian Embassy in Beijing since 2011 to take the temperature of the Chinese economy up close. Their work, together with the work of our Australian-based staff, directly informs our Monetary Policy Board's deliberations, most recently earlier this week, and our broader analysis. As you say, I recently joined the team over in China to speak with a wide range of organisations drawn from right across the Chinese economy and the Australian export community in Beijing and Shanghai. The trip, which had been arranged months earlier as a kind of routine get-to-know-you session, turned out to be pretty auspiciously timed, because it came in the week after so-called Liberation Day, when, of course, US tariffs on China rose to 145% and China retaliated in kind. Tonight, I want to discuss four key themes that we heard that week, and which, despite the further dramatic turn of events since then, seem to me at least so far to have stood the test of time. For anyone wanting to cut to the chase, or in the words of the Mandarin saying, open the door and see the mountain, I'll put it more bluntly, don't count China out. My first theme is that nearly everyone we spoke with felt that the Chinese economy was at last turning a corner in the months leading up to the 2nd of April. First, the September 24 Politburo announcements and subsequent policy pivot were seen as a recognition of the need both for further stimulus and for a more determined switch in emphasis from boosting supply to boosting demand. Second, the DeepSeek announcement, President Xi's meeting with business leaders in the private sector, and his well-publicised handshake with Jack Ma triggered renewed optimism in support for the private sector, its capacity to innovate, harness the benefits from high technology, after a well-known period of negative government sentiment, declining foreign investment and technology embargoes. And third, property markets seem finally to be showing some signs of stabilising, at least in bigger cities, after years of declining sales, investment and prices. Now, it's important to put those points in context. For anyone visiting China, and I'm sure there's many of you here, the ever-present abandoned housing developments and stationary cranes provide a pretty potent reminder of the challenges that the Chinese economy has been through. But an improvement in sentiment, if it persists, would itself be important as an economic development after such a long period in the doldrums. Harder data also support the view that domestic demand growth had begun to strengthen at the beginning of 25. My second theme is against that backdrop. The eye-popping tariff tit-for-tat escalation in early April came as a genuine shock to pretty much everyone we spoke to. Significant increases were, of course, expected, and I asked many, what had you expected? But there was real surprise across three dimensions. On scale, people had typically expected there to be a sort of 25 to 50 percentage point increase. Anything over 60 was judged to be an effective embargo. On speed, expectations of some kind of rolling increase or a negotiation period were dashed. And on scope, the huge tariffs on China's Southeast Asian neighbours were seen as being aimed at cutting off trade and production chains, linking China to the US through third countries. Some also contrasted the scale and immediacy of the Chinese retaliation with the absence of a similar reaction in Europe, elsewhere in the West, disappointing those who hope for a common front. It's difficult to quantify the economic impact that those sort of mega tariffs could have had on China. Expectations in China appear to be in the range of 1.5 to 2 percentage points of GDP in 2025 before accounting for any stimulus. Those are very big numbers, but for every expression of surprise, we also heard, a survey said, a striking confidence that China was going into this trade war with a strong hand. Judged solely in economic terms, that view rested on 4 main planks. Firstly, a deep belief in the authorities' commitment to deliver the growth target of around 5% a year. And that goal, of course, can and does attract skepticism in many quarters. The Chinese bond yield, 10-year bond yield at sort of 1.5 to 2% range suggests at the very least that market participants have doubts over what sort of number you'll see in the medium term. But I was very struck that the commitment to that goal had a completely totemic status amongst many of those we spoke with, which by itself might suggest that the political costs of bearing from it would be large. Second, we found a confidence that the Chinese authorities had the tools, the policy tools, the space, and the will to inject domestic stimulus needed to compensate for weaker trade growth. And there are limits to that, of course, and I could list many. Past efforts to boost domestic consumption have had what I think a central banker would call mixed success. Many of the authorities' existing policy tools are better suited to boosting supply, diverting resources from consumption and adding further production capacity, bearing down on inflation. And the barriers to a more persistent rise in consumption are arguably as much structural as cyclical: limited social safety net, constraints on the use of capital markets to manage savings, and so forth. And there are questions, too, about how much headroom there is for stimulus. Public debt is elevated, particularly at local government level. Nominal interest rates are low and focus on exchange rate and financial stability as much as demand management. And the central bank has made it pretty clear it does not favour quantitative easing. That might be one reason why the authorities bided their time in the immediate aftermath of the 2nd of April. Many we spoke to were expecting some kind of big bazooka policy package in the days afterwards. It didn't come. But a range of monetary and financial easing has subsequently been announced, and the authorities have been pretty clear that they're committed to expand fiscal policy if needed to support the growth target. Now, third, and if we could have the next chart, we heard a general expectation that a large share of the economic costs of US tariffs would fall on the US itself, and a determination not to cushion that impact. And let me tell you what this chart shows, because I was told and it probably wouldn't be immediately obvious. I'm sure that's true. So along the x-axis, you have the Chinese share of US imports, and along the y-axis, you have the US share of China exports. And so the blobs are, a bunch of relatively disaggregated product categories, and the size of the circles show the relative weight in total trade. Now, at nearly half of China's exports to the US are products for which the US has limited alternative external suppliers. That's lithium batteries, computers, smartphones, video game consoles. That's the blobs in the bottom right, which we've labelled high China market power. The massive advance in technology diffusion is, it's a truism, but I'll say it, really striking to anyone who visits China. I was only in China a few years ago, and the pace of change, even in those few years, was blatantly evident everywhere you went. The pass-through of US tariffs to US consumer prices for those goods in the bottom right is likely to be high and quick, and that probably explains why many were quickly exempted from US tariffs. Much of the rest of China's exports, shown in the lower left-hand quadrant, are products for which the US is not a dominant source of demand, so in all likelihood could be diverted to other markets if needed. There are far fewer products in the upper part of the chart where the US accounts for a large share of Chinese imports. The inflationary impact of US tariffs on US consumers could, of course, be reduced if the Chinese currency were devalued substantially, happened in 2018-19. But on our trip, we heard very little expectation that such a thing would happen, because China will want to avoid insulating the US from its own tariffs, provoking retaliation from other countries, triggering capital outflow of the kind seen around the 2015 devaluation, or undermining the political and social gains, including recognition of China's economic and technological advance, perceived to flow, rightly or wrongly, from a stronger exchange rate. Indeed, some noted that if you look at simple measures of purchasing power parity, like the Economist Big Mac Index, the Chinese currency is more likely to appreciate than depreciate if left to its own devices. There was, of course, a clear recognition that Chinese exporters would face real economic costs if high tariffs persisted. It was too early, though, to see any of that at the time of our visit. Many voiced a determination to face into it if it came. Fourth, we heard real doubts about how much manufacturing capacity currently done in China could relocate to the US, even if that was the incentive. Elevated labour costs and a finite stock of advanced manufacturing skills were thought to make it impossible to produce many of the goods at the prices US consumers expected to pay, as would the absence of the highly integrated, co-located supply chains that developed within China and across Asia. There were doubts too, obviously, about the viability of long-term investment in factories while the volatility of US policy remains so high. More recent weeks have walked back some of the precipice a little. The rapid reductions in US tariffs on China's Asian neighbours saw an immediate pickup in production and export via third countries. This was evident in the April trade data, and the threat of mutual assured economic destruction provided the context, at the very least, for the rapid, if ostensibly temporary, reduction of US and China tariffs. Those tariffs still remain well above historical levels, of course, and future increases or other trade barriers can't be ruled out. But in view of the near-term de-escalation, China's seemingly strong negotiating position and its scope to inject further stimulus, our baseline projection for Chinese GDP growth in the May statement on monetary policy is 4.8% in 25 and 4.4% in 26, only modestly changed on 3 months ago. Turning to my fourth theme, as part of our trip we held a roundtable discussion organised by the Australian Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai with a big group of Australian firms active in China: retail, agriculture, banking, finance, law, steel, healthcare, manufacturing and commercial property. And what really struck me about that session, was how upbeat many, if not all of those firms were about the implications of what seemed a pretty dramatic set of events for their own business. The recovery in sentiment at the start of that year, 25, and confidence that the authorities would do what it takes to sustain the economy was part of it. But there was also a sense that recent developments in trade policy could enhance their competitive position in China. There's a risk, of course, of survivor and recency bias in those sorts of discussions, and the firms involved vary considerably in size and therefore macroeconomic impact. But we heard something similar in separate discussions with companies active in steel and iron ore, the latter, of course, being Australia's biggest export to China by a long way. They saw few threats to the scale and cost advantages of Australian ore relative to other producers in the near term. Longer-term challenges, of course, from the energy transition are a different matter. Their central expectation was for Chinese steel output to remain relatively robust, at or around about 1 billion tonnes a year in the near term, and a large majority of Chinese steel is consumed domestically. Demand's been sustained in recent years by a pivot from property-related uses to manufacturing, and further Chinese policy stimulus was expected to continue to involve a lot of steel-intensive investment, despite that aimed at pivot to consumption. Chinese steel exports were obviously seen as more vulnerable to a slowdown in global growth, but direct exports account for only about 1/10 of Chinese steel output, very little, if any, that goes to the US, and indirect exports via steel-intensive products like machinery, ships and cars are roughly the same again. So let me conclude. My goal this evening was deliberately narrow, to set out what I heard in China in the immediate aftermath of Liberation Day. That narrative, at that time, was pretty positive, that the Chinese economy was seen as picking up in early 25, that China felt it had a strong hand in responding to the economic impact of tariffs, and that Australian companies in China saw opportunities amidst the risks. But just as clearly, it was also partial in 4 ways. First, it was just a moment in time, and as Jay Powell reminded us recently, life moves pretty fast. Tariff settings have already moved on dramatically and will doubtless change further up or down. We'll soon start to see data on how the existing tariffs, still high by historical standards, are affecting Chinese and global economies. Second, it was just one set of views from one country with a story to tell. Some of the judgments may prove wider than mark. The tolerance for bearing economic costs may prove lower. Domestic stimulus may prove to be harder to deliver, and so on. Third, no in-the-moment assessment can hope to capture the general equilibrium effects of such dramatic changes. An example of this is the possibility that Australian firms might in time face more intense competition at home and overseas from Chinese firms discounting output that they can't sell in the US anymore. It's unclear to me how big an effect that will be in Australia, given the limited overlap between Chinese and Australian outputs, but it's clearly on the minds of others in the Asia-Pacific region, and I know Richard and others will want to talk about it a bit more. Last but not least is perhaps the elephant in the room, how purely economic factors of the kind I've discussed here will interact with more strategic considerations, and where that leaves Australia. I've neither the competence nor the authority to discuss such issues, but I know that the others on the panel and you here in the audience will do, and you probably want to talk about much else. So let's get on with that. I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Start that one. Okay, thank you, Andrew, for very interesting remarks and very much on time as well for our schedule. So that's always quite an achievement. For our audience, we are now, of course, moving on to the panel discussion part of our event. So just a heads up, after I ask a few questions of our panel, I'll be turning to the audience. If you can have some good questions for our panel, that would be excellent. So Andrew, of course, starting with you, I mean, fairly safe to say you gave a fairly positive take on the view, at least coming out of China, in terms of their ability to weather a trade war with the United States. But can I ask you, to what extent do you yourself sort of agree with the views that you heard, or alternatively, perhaps where are the biggest gaps or uncertainties between what you heard on the one hand and your own assessment?
Yeah, well, and you say my own, I'll qualify that by the RBA's. I mean, as I try to set out this is very much a readout on what we heard, and obviously you can make many judgments about where those comments may have come from, how truthful they are, how much weight you should place on them. So, for example, and perhaps it's the most important in some ways, the commitment to pivot from supply to demand, from external to internal demand, has been around for a long while. Hasn't had a huge effect on the composition of Chinese growth. The question about whether the toolkit is suited to doing that, even if you want to do it, do you have the right levers to pull to deliver it? And the question of headroom, as I said, are ones that people will raise. I think, as I said, you can debate the numbers and you can debate the precise channels. But our view, and we only have to forecast luckily 2 years ahead, I think a very interesting question is what are we talking about 5, 10, 20 years ahead? That's a much, in some ways, much more interesting question given the demographic trends that are involved. But in the short run, a couple of years, we do share a relatively upbeat view. I was saying to one of the colleagues earlier, for much of our international outlook, we take consensus numbers from external forecasts, but we do our own China forecast. And our own China forecast, as I said, is a shade under 5. In 25 for growth, and a little bit weaker in 26, but still pretty strong. And that plays its part in our overall projection for inflation. So I'd love to hear from the panel where the weaknesses in the story are. I'm sure there are many, but qualitatively speaking, we are relatively upbeat about the prospects for China despite a number of these. Let me say one final thing, and it was widely reported. We did a scenario with a number of scenarios actually in our statement on monetary policy this week, and clearly this is under a baseline in which tariffs stay at the current levels or maybe moderate a little bit further. There are clearly any number of alternative scenarios in which the outcomes are far worse, and we showed one of those in the statement on monetary policy. China would obviously play its part in that, whether it was because it got hit by strategic embargoes, whether its own economy collapsed, whether the attempts to stimulate failed, all of the ifs, that would be clearly much more serious for Australia, for the global economy. We talked in the forecast about what that might look like. So who knows? This is a highly unpredictable situation. Our central case is a relatively optimistic one. You can easily tell a much more negative story.
Yeah, well, I think that's very good. And I do want to come back to how you deal with and grapple with all of this uncertainty, because I'm sure it does not make your job remotely easier than it already was. But Richard, you've also just come back from a trip from China, so I thought I'd just bring you in. I mean, did you pick up on similar vibes, or were there any particular points of distinction from what we've just heard from the Deputy Governor?
I was sort of stumbling around, I think, either in Andrew's wake or just before or after him in Beijing and Shanghai with some colleagues from Lowy. As a non-economist on the panel speaking about economics, I've written myself some notes tonight so I make sure I don't lose myself. So I will elaborate on and qualify some of the point about confidence. Now, when you talk about Chinese confidence, it's not just confidence in economic numbers, it's confidence in their system. And this goes back, we've had waves of Chinese confidence in 2008 with the global financial crisis. China came out quickly. When Trump was first elected in 2016, that was a boost in Chinese confidence. Early days of COVID, China did very well as well. Each of those moments turned into hubris, and then China was brought back down to earth a little bit. This time might be different because of the nature of Trump and the nature of what he's doing with the US economy. So there's other sound basis for the confidence as well, I think. A couple of things. Andrew mentioned DeepSeek. That was a big deal. This week we had in Hong Kong the listing of CATL, by far the most preeminent advanced battery company in the world. They raised more than $5 billion in Hong Kong. They wouldn't bother going to the US to raise money. The Chinese also are much better prepared for Trump this time around than they were first time around. Some people were saying to me in Japan this week, they mark China's preparation for Trump to Xi Jinping going to France in early 2023. Even then, they were starting to sort of shape the battlefield, as the Pentagon says, in Europe and the like, readying for Trump. They're also better prepared to handle Trump's tariffs. I think a friend of mine said, the US is doing a tariff war. China is doing a supply chain war. They just pick stuff out of the supply chain and put immediate pressure onto the US, as per your graph up there, that they've got great leverage there. But let me just now talk about the qualification side of that. First of all, it doesn't matter how good Chinese tech is, it's not going to make up for the gap caused by the collapse or slowdown of the property market, which was 25-30% of growth. Secondly, there's a lot of very respected opinion that Chinese growth rates for the last 3 years, the official growth rates, I'm not saying they're fake, but they're genuinely exaggerated. China's stopped publishing a lot of economic figures. It's harder to measure, and you look by other measures, it's not 5% last year, maybe half of that, might not be 5% this year. And you can tell the Chinese government is worried because local economists are under political instruction not to talk down the economy, not to talk about lower growth, not to talk about the problems. And that's a reflection of the post-COVID, end of COVID collapse in consumer confidence. Going back to the other side of the ledger, these issues have played out, politically, particularly in the short term. All the pain points, genuine pain points experienced by the United States, they are immediately played out in the political system, in the markets, in the bond markets, in importers like the Port of Los Angeles talking about the collapse in traffic coming across the Pacific, in companies like Walmart talking about we're going to pass the cost of tariffs on to consumers, which sends Trump crazy. So in China, they don't have to worry about any of that because they can control the narrative. All the pain points there are suppressed effectively, not completely. So they can control the politics of it a lot more than the United States. And look what happened with Trump before they had the sort of truce in Geneva or Switzerland. Electronics, that's the export which is most dependent on the US market. All that needs to happen is Tim Cook rings Trump or the Treasury Secretary and says, we're going to have to double the price of iPhones next week. Immediately, electronics is completely exempted. Few more points. So they can win maybe the political war initially. That's not the same thing as saying the Chinese economy won't be really badly affected. And you can see about that by the talk about stimulus and a sudden slowdown in the Chinese economy. I think you alluded to this. Means that the stimulus is going to be focused on steel-intensive industries, which frankly is the last thing they want to do or should be doing. And if you're going to have a short-term impetus for the Chinese economy, you're not going to get it from consumption, particularly if factories are closing and people are being laid off. I've got a few other points, but I'll wait to the next question. I'll end there. Thanks.
Well, I think those are very excellent points, Richard, and I think an interesting distinction between their ability to in a grand sort of sense, whether and maybe even to the extent they think win the trade war versus the idea that actually they, in that process, they might be severely damaged. And if we're talking about the Australian economy, of course, and there's direct flow on for us. You mentioned technology, and I want to shift across to that because a lot of the time we focus just on tariffs, but anyone following US-China economic relations and geostrategic tensions know a lot of it, most of it even, is all about technology. There's a technological competition around AI, semiconductors, robotics, clean energy technology. So, Jenny, just to bring you into this discussion, how do you see the dynamics there in terms of the tech war between the two countries? And then where does that leave Australia as a small open economy reliant on global technological advancement for our own productivity?
So the models of technology are really different in the US and in China. And their model has actually worked remarkably well. And I think that, we need to understand that. And the massive government investment is delivering. And so the US was trying to cut them off. I mean, even Obama was, the Trans-Pacific Partnership partly was aimed at trying to isolate China out of certain things. And Biden's policies were definitely aimed at that. And what that did was really put China onto steroids in terms of actually developing its own tech. So the challenge is that it's made this massive investment in R&D, engineering, robotics in ways that the US has yet to do. And then it's also made an investment in a lot of the UN standard-setting bodies, in WIPO and others. And so it's actually trying to, kind of really be there at that sort of tech edge, and so then promulgate it and say, this is the trading partners, this is the options. The challenge is that the US wants to say to partners, countries like Australia, you're with us or you're against us, so you've got to be in our camp and not in China's camp, and China is pushing back against that. And where we live, underneath bottom Asia, we need to be able to trade with all the countries in our region. So we need interoperability. And so this is the big challenge, is that what's going to happen in actually the tech war, I think, is going to be ultimately the really big question of whether we end up with tech bubbles where you belong to the US tech bubble or you belong to China's tech bubble, where Europe turns up in this, which bubble it belongs to, or whether we actually get enough interoperability between systems that allow both systems to actually develop. And I think what we need to be thinking about with the partners in the region is to say, that's the option we want. We can't let the trade war turn into a tech war. And we really need to push very strongly back against that. So I think that US isn't nearly as far ahead as they think they are in things like AI. The chips have sort of proven that, NVIDIA is actually really terrified that it's, China's actually going to crowd it out, that it won't dominate the chip market, high-end chip market, if things keep going the way they're going. So I think we need to actually see some real cooperative activity to try and say there is a third way. Let's try and make sure there's that interoperability and don't let countries be caught between it, because Australia will be in a real pickle on that one.
I want to come back to you, Jenny, about this idea of how do we respond and how do we partner with other countries, because of course we're too small but to do so on our own. But just coming back to you, Andrew, I mean, hearing from Richard and Jenny, we're hearing about a lot of more messy geopolitics. In the short term there are the shocks. In the long term there's the fragmentation and the crimping of sources of productivity growth. All of that has a bearing on how the RBA makes its decisions. I think in your speech you said, you're not an expert on geopolitics, but as they say, the geopolitics is interested in you. So can you just share a little bit of light? How do you grapple with these questions, the huge amounts of uncertainty, the potential for shocks, what it does to the ability to use models to look backwards in order to look forwards? How do you grapple with all of that, especially when monetary policy operates with a lag? And you want to be ahead of the curve, not behind it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, when I was interested in the job over here, I thought that one of the reasons I might be disqualified was because I came from a country that had just bounced from one crisis to another, right? And was coming to a country that had frankly had, decades of spectacular economic performance in Australia. And so in the UK, you've got quite used in the last few decades to these enormous shocks, whether it is the global financial crisis that was an enormous event in the UK in a way I don't think it really was here economically. Brexit, of course, which whether that counts as geopolitics, I think it probably does, still working through. And the Ukraine event, which was up close and personal for a country that had built its entire energy system around gas. The fact that the price of gas went through the roof was an enormous thing. And none of those were predictable events, I would say. And yet they determine fundamentally the economic outlook. Central bankers do struggle a little bit with the what-ifs in terms of geopolitics. We're trying to do a bit better. If you just put shocks like actually what Trump's just done through normal macroeconomic models, they often give you surprisingly small impacts. Now, part of that is a reason actually that the model's telling you something important, which is modern, well-developed economies have more stabilizers and offsetting factors. We saw that, didn't we, with the trade dispute between China and Australia a few years ago, where in fact trade diverted quite effectively, and there are a number of ways that meant that the worst outcomes didn't actually occur. So some of those, slightly more benign predictions turn out to be the case, but my examples of Brexit and other things obviously disprove that. You can ask what ifs in a policy context, and we're getting better at that than we used to be in central banking. The question is, once you've done the what ifs, what do you do with them? Do you simply say, well, that's jolly interesting, and if one of these things happens, we'll react, but until we do, we'll just keep on going? Do you lean into it to a certain degree? Well, there's an X% chance that, the 145% tariffs might be put on the world economy. That can be a very hard thing to explain when the tariffs haven't yet hit. And it's interesting in Australia, as Michelle Bullock was talking about earlier this week, whereas in many economies, the forward-looking surveys and indicators are already turned down very sharply. Businesses and households very uncertain and nervous about the global impact. So far, the forward-looking indicators in Australia have not really moved at all. That might be a great sign of resilience in the economy. It might be a sign of lags. I don't know. But you need to ask yourself, what is the probability that these things actually affect it? Because if you run after every geopolitical story, you'd be moving policy up and down very rapidly. There's a third recommendation that people sometimes suggest in the model, the so-called Knightian uncertainty, right, which is that you should try and do, I can never remember if it's maxi-min or mini-max, someone will remember, maybe you do, but you should set policy to reduce the cost of the worst possible outcome. That's actually a pretty hard principle to implement, right? There's always a chance you might get run over on the road in the morning, maybe you should never get up. That's obviously not a sensible strategy. But in certain circumstances, if we know in COVID, you have to go from being very tentative and slight to saying, right, wham, this is an enormous unknown. You have to slash rates or inject liquidity into the economy very sharply in order to respond. We're not at that situation yet. That's why we talked about the scenarios in the monetary policy report this week, but we're not in that situation yet. But hopefully by thinking through some of these scenarios, we're ready to act if we need to. And that was the message we were trying to give.
Richard, just to bring you in, I mean, you're, of course, not a central banker, so you can speculate all you like on the geopolitics. But what's your sort of advice for a room here thinking a lot about the economic implications and how economic policy can manage what's going on in the world? What are your thoughts about how Australia needs to think about geopolitics, our relationships with, and how we manage them with China and the United States? China's our biggest trading partner. It's also our main security concern. America is our biggest security ally. It's also our biggest economic concern at the moment. It's crisscrossing in every direction. What's your thoughts on what we do?
Well, I wish I knew, all sorts of scary scenarios, bearing down on Australia and indeed the world. But let me approach it by, I think that one of the worst impacts of, or biggest impacts of the Trump's tariff approach. Remember, when Trump has put all these tariffs on, in theory, Trump hasn't even got to China yet. He hasn't looked at, the geopolitics of China, the military balance, all that sort of thing. He's made it all about economics. But it plays into the worst instincts of the Chinese system, which have always been there, which have always been strong, which is autarky. They want self-reliance. They want to have the tech to do to America what they think America wants to do to them. That's the truth of it. And as they're not doing too badly at that. That's been their aim for many years. But in terms of the Chinese economy, there's a big contradiction there, and you can see this in the big debates inside China about this. Xi Jinping has empowered national security in the Chinese economy, and that in turn has empowered the Ministry of State Security, which is the main intelligence agency. So that's one side of it. That's the autarkic side of it, the anti-American side of it. The other side of it is, a globalized China which has thrived on globalization. So that's why with China you get all these contradictions in policy these days. One day we love foreigners, we love FDI, win-win cooperation, let's make money together. The next day, foreigners are spies, we're raiding your company, and our policy is self-reliance. And there's two powerful streams grappling there, and you'd have to say the national security side is winning, and Trump has played into that. He's empowered that. And then that leads us on to the sorts of issues that Australia faces. I mean, total decoupling is not possible. If there were a conflict, a genuine military conflict, you'd have decoupling overnight. Let's not say that's about to happen or anything. But there could be large-scale discoupling, total distrust of China, in China of the United States. Is it too strong a step to then think, if China wants to basically fortify itself against the US, does it then want to fortify itself against US allies? Now, it can't easily cut off Japan and South Korea because they're part of the intricate supply chain. They certainly rely on Australia for certain minerals now, but will they really make a concerted effort to buy more expensive iron ore from West Africa or Brazil? When we were in China, there was a delegation of 200 business people from Brazil in China. That the Brazil-China relationship is going gangbusters, and they compete with us in a lot of areas. So, could we see, China wasn't able to discipline Australia, teach us a lesson, whatever you want to say, 2-3 years ago when they put on the punitive trade measures. But if they really got serious about it, could they really hurt us? Then what would we do? We're not going to be selling the same amounts of iron ore and other goods to India, I can tell you that. And so, I don't want to say we're reliant on China. I like to think we're interdependent, but China could change that, and I'm not sure what we could do about that.
We're getting a bit tight on time, and I do want to go to the audience, so maybe just a quick prep. We actually have some people who are ready for questions, or we might go to the audience, and maybe I'll come back to Jenny if we have time interspersed within that. So please wait for the microphone to come to you, and state your name and any relevant affiliation, and please stick to a question. So we have one question from the gentleman here.
That,
sorry, name, affiliation.
Yes, Carl Charney, doctor. It seems that strategically, when I lived in China under Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin, there was a lot of friendship between the West, US, and China. It really went beautifully. And now if you look at it, what's really happening in the background strategically? I mean, Xi Jinping has fired, I don't know how many generals in the army. He's fired, I don't know how many people. There seems to be a lot of political, real conflict and real issues in China right now. And many Chinese actually are worried. When I speak to many Chinese, they're actually worried about the political situation in China. To what extent? And then Europe is not happy with China helping Russia in respect to Ukraine. I mean, I'm European, I can tell you, they're really pissed off. You can see with Xi Jinping in Moscow. So what's really happening in the background, and to what extent is that going to have an impact? Thank you.
There's probably a question for Richard. Do we have another question we could collect now from the gentleman over there?
Hello, Samuel Yang from ABC News. Thanks so much for sharing your insights to the panel. And my question is to Andrew. Some international retailers like Sandal brand, Birkenstock, and jeweler Pandora are considering to pass on the cost of US tariffs by raising prices globally. Could that impose a threat to Australian inflation?
So who would like to go first? What's happening in the background?
Well, look, I'll just be very brief, but I do think that Xi Jinping is much more a continuum than an aberration. He's doing all the sorts of things that he's doing around Taiwan, in the Sea of Japan, in South China Sea, more assertive posture with the United States. Hu Jintao and Jiang Zemin would have loved to have done them, but they didn't have the economic capability, economic weight, or military capability that Xi Jinping has. So I don't think that things were, going beautifully, quote unquote, under previous Chinese leaders. What we have now is a much more powerful country, and Xi Jinping is taking advantage of that. Yes, he is the great accelerator, but I don't think Chinese policy has changed. They can just do everything they always wanted to do. That's my rather grim reply.
Andrew?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It's not the normal one we think about, right? Because we normally think that US firms would, raise prices in the US for US tariffs, and some question about whether Chinese firms might, sell relatively cheap goods here because they can't sell them in the US anymore. If I was thinking about advising Walmart or whoever, I can't remember which examples you used, I'd advise them to think quite carefully before that strategy, and here's why. Presumably the idea is you raise prices in other markets so that you don't have to raise prices as much in the US and do a kind of profit maximizing strategy, right? That's only likely to work if the price elasticity of demand for your product in the US is higher than it is outside the US, right? In other words, you're worried that if you raise the price very much in the US demand will fall a lot and you'll lose a lot of money. Whereas if you raise the price elsewhere, people will love your product and they won't move away from you. In truth, it's likely to be the other way around, right? In truth, you're more likely to have customer loyalty in your home market than you are overseas. So by all means, firms can try and raise prices wherever they want. There's no rule against it. But I would have thought that anyone looking carefully at the kind of demand curves that they face in different countries would say, trying to insulate your US demand by putting prices up in other markets might be self-defeating because you might just end up killing your demand everywhere. Now, there's an interesting question about pharmaceuticals and other very bespoke products and the interaction with public subsidy schemes and so on and forth, which is much more complicated, I think. But for a firm like the one you described, I'd be interested to see it. Maybe we'll get an experiment and see how that goes.
It also begs the question, doesn't it, that why wouldn't they put their prices up anyway?
Well,
we'll bear it, it's sort of...
Pushing inflation up. I wouldn't say it's the biggest risk that we face at the moment, no, to be quite honest. The biggest risk that we've identified in our most recent report is in a downside scenario that demand globally would fall and that would pull aggregate demand down in Australia. I think we've also talked, as I say, about the possibility actually that some cheaper diverted Chinese goods could pull inflation down a little bit further. The more interesting, sorry, no disrespect, but the more interesting question I think on the upside for inflation is actually the potential impairment of supply chains. So I don't think it's the sort of result of a kind of optimizing strategy of the kind you described, which kind of assumes, continued free trade, but actually the possibility that, when you look at some of these supply chains for products, they're stunningly sophisticated now, whether it's products produced in Asia or produced in the US and, things moving across borders multiple times and being produced just in time and so on and so forth. And we learned in COVID, didn't we, that when you jam a great big screwdriver into that supply chain, all hell breaks loose, and it's inflationary. So there are possibilities that if this goes far enough and it impairs global supply chains, that could push inflation up here and everywhere else for a period. I don't know that our thinking at the moment is that that's the most likely risk, but if it happened, it could be very serious.
Okay, next question, Joe Masters at the front.
You have to ask her what her China forecast is before she's allowed to ask a question.
Ours is 4%, Andrew. We're
she's there, straight there.
We're a bit bearish. I'm Joe Masters, Barrenjoey. Thanks to the panel for your insights. I actually wanted to follow up, Andrew, on your earlier comments. Appreciate your comments from being on the ground in China. It's always a fascinating trip to do. But I'm also aware that you spend time meeting Australian businesses, and the economic data is quite dated at the moment, and so it's hard to really see the impact of the shock from Liberation Day. And I wondered if you were happy to share some anecdotes of what you're hearing around from Australian businesses in terms of their supply chains, tariffs, and how they're tackling that and their plans going forward.
I mean, I think, and we published the liaison results, as you know, in the Statement of Monetary Policy earlier this week. I think the honest truth is that, I mean, any firm, with any kind of international business has been spending a lot of time thinking about the what-ifs, very similar to the kind of, geopolitical modelling that the central banks have to do, firms have to do it too. I guess if you're an international, multinational firm, you may have some resources in McKinsey to throw at it. If you're a small enterprise in Queensland or something, you're on your own, right? And that is difficult. Our sense is that whilst people are looking for the effects, they are nervous about the effects, but so far they haven't seen them. And there are, as you well know better than anyone, there are a number of pre-existing economic challenges in the Australian economy that are still front of mind for many of those businesses. So far so good. We are very, as I suspect you are too, carefully on the lookout for signs of this impacting them. So far, we're not seeing it as a macro trend, but that doesn't mean it's not coming. As you say, I mean, even now we're only a few weeks away from what's going on.
Any other questions? Maybe just down here in the middle.
Hi, Nick Files from the Financial Times. Just to Richard's point about whether China tries to decouple from us and the impact that could have on the iron ore market, is that something the RBA can factor in as a what if, given?
Say again, Nick. The decouple on the
iron, sort of, if it's iron ore or specifically. I mean, it's a bit of a doomsday scenario, but is that something the RBA can factor into your longer term forecasts?
I hesitate to talk in detail about the iron ore market. I'm not an expert, but I think there's a couple of interesting, early developments. The first is the iron ore price globally has barely moved. I think that surprised quite a few people. Obviously, the price is not set by Australian ore because we're not the marginal producer, and that of course is someone called it the river of gold. I can't remember if it was someone here or somewhere else. I mean, that is the benefit of having a large stock of relatively cost-effective iron ore, that Australia is able to, take the benefit between the world price that's set by the marginal supplier, that's not us with higher costs, and the lower production price that we have. What that does mean is that, assuming that there are not embargoes put in place, Australia is at the front of the queue for any iron ore that is sold in China for the time being. Big if there, of course, is the energy transition. We were hearing from a prominent figure only, I think, yesterday or today about that particular issue. That's a medium-term issue to do with whether Australian ore can be used in electric arc furnaces. It can't at the moment. Maybe it needs to be. But I think, so far, the prognosis for the near-term outlook for demand for iron ore is relatively stable. As Richard said, if you start to do the sort of what-ifs of what if there's an embargo, what if China goes completely down the drain and Australia has to look to somewhere else to sell its iron ore, there aren't many other markets of the size or scale of demand needed to compensate for Chinese demand. India is one obvious thought, but they have their own supply of iron ore, and their steel industry is massively smaller than China. I mean, over a 5 to 10 year period, you build new factories, you shift production, but in the short term, China is the key market for that output. And look, that goes to wider questions about whether Australian economy needs to be diversifying away from reliance on one or two commodities to a broader thing. That's a broader debate, clearly.
Okay, we'll go to the next question, just here in the middle in the front.
You're picking all the journalists.
Give them a chance.
Give them a chance? Some of these guys. Anyway, Swati.
Swati from Bloomberg News. Andrew, Michelle Bullock is traveling to China next week. Just wanted to understand, how is her trip going to be different to yours?
I don't know, if I'm honest with you, what her schedule is. Perhaps I should ask. She will be meeting official partners in Beijing in particular, and we'll be talking about the economy several weeks on, clearly, from when I was there. It was good to be there in the heart of things, but also less good because you couldn't see the impacts of things. And she'll be interested in discussing payments and technology trends and other things that she's also expert in. But I don't have the details, Swati. I'm sure you can get that from our press office.
Okay, maybe any other questions from the floor? Can we get a hard one from Stephen Grenville?
Stephen Grenville. He's warned me in advance. It's not for me. Ex-RBA.
Your predecessor?
Thanks for the chance to ask a question. Is this on? The focus of the debate in Australia has all been about Trump's tariffs, but it might turn out that the tariffs are not a big deal at all, for the reason that you mentioned, that modelling shows that you can't get much effect from them. But J.D. Vance, in an interview this morning over the last day with the New York Times, has really downplayed the tariffs. He basically said, by the time it's all settled, there's nothing much here. So the question is what the debate should be, and I want to argue that it's all on the security side. It's largely on the security side, but economists have a big input to that, but so far they can't find a common language, common words to talk between the security people and the economists. So here's the question at last. How do we change that and find some common dialogue between economists and the security people?
Jenny, that was your career for a while.
Well, it was for a while.
Yeah.
It's not easy, is the answer. I think it's actually engaging in those conversations. That's one of the challenges, is that the security people think that they've got it nailed, and the economists think that they've got it nailed, and you really got to get both groups in the room and sort of realise that there's so many interactions. And the points of leverage are often the economic ones. And so we've got this whole sort of economic weaponisation type of things. But there are also your points of leverage of engagement. And so Amy King has done a really nice research work looking at pre-World War I China and Japan at war. Trade went on. Security, they kind of had a war and all the trade kept going, which was a bit the way things went. And so in some ways we need to be thinking about whether everything is getting recognised and everything becomes security, or whether we can actually start using the economic relationships to say, what can we carve out that, because it's in mutual interest, that we can actually keep and stable. And this is where things like interoperability of tech standards become really important. China agreeing not to go dump a whole bunch of cheap stuff on a bunch of markets and then play into Trump's idea of everybody isolating China and putting tariffs on China. So restraint, that actually then gives them soft power, or if you like, some cred or some influence. And so we need to be starting to think about security also from that dimension of, it's not just about the military power and whether you can, bomb somebody, but whether you've actually got some soft power and some influence and where that comes in. And economic relationships are a really good way to kind of build that. So that's my take on it, but I think there's always the danger that you get a Putin who just invades. And that's one of the challenges, because nothing economic about that. There's no economics in that decision-making. And so the question is, what's a credible defence where, to take Sam, who's standing up the back's echidna strategy, being very prickly so they don't want to go down that line. But it's really tricky because we're caught. We're really caught between the US and China on this. We need China economically. We need to be part of the region, because it's not just China. It's all the, it's Indonesia and it's Malaysia and it's Thailand and it's Vietnam, and it's those relationships. That's what we need to be part of. And for them, they're also balancing. They don't want to be, dominated by China either. So I think there's an awful lot that we can do in our region that's of mutual interest economically, And that also will sort of say, well, really, China, you don't want to go down that pathway strategically on a security front, because that just upsets the apple cart. And we all know that the most important thing actually is your own domestic stability, because, you know, there's only so much you can do by, you know, social control and the like, and ultimately, unless you're actually making your people at least feel like there's a future for them, that they're not going to cooperate. So that's my take on it. It's probably a little hopeful, but I think that's the only way I can sort of bring the two together. But it is about having the conversations. We need to have those conversations.
I just want to say tangentially,
30 seconds.
less than 30 seconds, trade going on anyway. Andrew's first graph, if you looked at it closely, you see we had massive trade with China in the 50s when we had under a US embargo. That was the country party and wheat, I think, Jim, wasn't it? And a huge amount of trade going on. And the same happened when they were punishing us a few months ago. We sent a massive amount of wheat to China once again because of Ukraine. So all these, it does go on anyway as well.
Okay, well, that's a good place to end. That's all we have time for. So please, everyone, join me in thanking the Deputy Governor and Jenny Gordon and Richard McGregor for an excellent discussion. And please feel free to stay behind for some networking and a few drinks.